right, we are live. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. We have Dr. Don Thompson. Gosh, I've known Don for 14, 15 years. We went to college together. Did a lot of nutrition classes growing up together. We still do. We just got back from Houston not long ago. So I'm happy to have a buddy of mine on, happy to have Don. I'm sure everybody will like him. He's pretty entertaining. He keeps me cracked up pretty good at conferences. So Don, we're talking about MAO and COMT today. These are some kind of complicated topics, and we get a lot of questions about these. So hopefully you can break it down for us. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And what kind words to say. Yeah. So thank you. So today we are going to talk about a couple of SNPs that MaxGen does provide. That's I'm very, very happy with. You know, I do a lot of different diagnostic testing in my office, and I can tell you using the genetics helps out a lot. It really does. It can get very confusing. Like you said, genetics it's not even a puzzle, it's a cobweb. Genetics, I feel like, are a cobweb, and they are like, it can be very overwhelming to try to follow each strand to where it goes. But if you just try to, and today we're going to try to make it a little simplified so you can look at it and say, oh, okay, well, maybe this does apply to me, maybe it doesn't. Best thing to do is, run the test. Don't guess, test. So we're just going to try to make it simple and say, okay, this isn't too complicated on a couple of things. I will say, starting out, when you look at these genes, specifically the MAO and mainly the COMT, but the MAO does apply. It goes into so many other genes and so many other factors as well, but we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to start that screen right now, and I apologize, this technical difficulties are just difficulties now. So MAO and COMT gene significance, that's me, Don Thompson. I am a chiropractic physician. I was actually raised by medical doctors and pharmacists. I never wanted to go into medicine. I wanted to do this because this was what the cool stuff was. The natural medicine and the alternative medicine was my passion. So here we go. So first of all, like I said, we're going to keep it really simple. So in the MAO and the COMT, we're mainly talking about neurotransmitters, but it's going to get a little bit deeper. So the neurotransmitters are just chemical messengers. They're going to send a neuron sends a signal to an end place. It is a message that gets sent from a neuron to a target cell, and that can be anything. It can be a muscle, another nerve, a gland, anything like that. But when that nerve sends out that signal basically all happens in the space between the two. And we call that the synapse or a neuromuscular junction, or it's a gap, right? But that message gets sent and it hangs out right here. And that's what it does. So when we talk about these things, if this sits here too long, it could be a problem. If it sits here too few of amount of time, then it can be a problem. So these genes are there to break those things down. So the breakdown actually comes from these enzymes that will break down anything. So anytime you hear the word ACE at the end of the word, here's some basic biochem. You hear the word like a monoamine oxidase. The ACE is an enzyme. So a lipase is a lipid. Lip means fat. Lipase breaks down fat. Easy enough. So what are we breaking down here? What are the neurotransmitters? The main neurotransmitter we're talking about. There's actually over 350 neurotransmitters, and we talk about 5 of them. It's kind of crazy, but they're the big ones that really make that we can actually visualize and we can see. Those are the big ones, but there's really small ones that happen all over, but we're trying to get the bigger picture to try to help people out. So serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Serotonin is responsible for mood, sleep, sexual function, bone reformation, actually, and blood clotting. The platelets actually have quite a lot of serotonin associated with them. However, the serotonin is mainly found in the gut. I think it's like 70 to 90%. I can't even remember the number anymore, but it's actually found in your gut. And in your gut, and we're going to talk about this too later, in your gut, that serotonin is helpful for the smooth muscle contraction, so getting motility, okay? Now, known dopamine, this is the pleasure neurotransmitter. But if you get too much, it's a really bad thing. You can have actually paranoia. But we're thinking about thinking and planning, striving, focus, and things that make you interested. I did see some research this year, last year, time is a construct. I don't know when I saw it, but they actually had, and this totally describes me to a T, that dopamine, that people can, being rewarded. So dopamine is also associated with reward. And there are people who can have a dopamine response with information, and it's the same response as other people who have that reward for money. So there's certain people that look at information, their brains basically look at information as a monetary unit. But it's all about dopamine and how our dopamine is metabolized in your brain. It's really interesting. Then you have norepinephrine, which actually comes from dopamine. So there's a transition, like all this stuff, like your body metabolizes things. Norepinephrine is alertness. And if you're from any European country, they would call it noradrenaline, because there's adrenaline and noradrenaline. We call it epinephrine and norepinephrine. Same thing. Alertness, arousal, attention, the sleep-wake cycle, and mood and memory. So it is a waker-upper. It's focus. It is that sympathetic pattern. Now, I talk a lot in the office about the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sympathetic is that fight or flight. And if there's a norepinephrine issue there, you could be fight or flight. So what is the MAO? And I might say MOA. Please forgive me if I do. MOA is something else, but I may interchange them on accident. But it stands for monoamine oxidase. I already said it once, but remember that ACE means enzyme. It's going to break down all of these things for us. Pretty much it. Now, we have two types. We have a MFC, and look, I did it on the slides too. I put MOA on the slides. See, sorry about that. So we have two types, the MAOA and the MAOB. The MAOA is more for the serotonin and norepinephrine, and I also didn't put dopamine on that slide, but the MAOB, there's a lot of acronyms and it's hard to keep up with all of them. It has a higher affinity for the phenylethylamine, which we're not really going to talk about today, but there are two types. I'm just getting over there. We're mainly talking about these other neurotransmitters. So when you're talking about genes, where does it come from? The MAO is very interesting because it's actually only carried by the female. And so the mother only carries it, and it doesn't matter if the dad has it or not because the mother is the carrier. So when you're talking about something like a genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, the mother and the father could carry it. But in this particular one, it's only the females that pass it down. So that means that the males when the male does have it, it doesn't mean they can't have it, but it means, and this is where genetics gets really confusing. The males can have it, they're not carriers, so they are what's called hemizygous. That's not a typo because you always hear about hetero and homozygous, but these are hemizygous, meaning they only have one copy. And that's what this is. Hemizygous means they only have one copy, so that means you can't have two copies that say you have one that's raised and one that's lowered. You just have one copy. That's basically what that means. So if you have a slow monoamine oxidase, that means the gene expression, the gene that turns on the manufacturing process for this enzyme, right? Little eaters, right? That means that the production is lower. And so if you have 100 units of a neurotransmitter, but you need 100 units to break it down, that means you may only have like 50 units, depending on, the genetic variants. So if it's slow and you have 100 units in that gap and you only have 50 units, you're not breaking down the neurotransmitter properly, and it's going to have a longer effect in that gap. Makes sense, right? So if it's fast, it means it's eating it right up. You're doing right along. So if you have 100 units, you might be making 20 units of the enzyme. These are arbitrary numbers. Please don't quote me on these. They're totally arbitrary. I'm just trying to get a concept across, and that's really what we try. And Chad and I actually talked about this the other day. Is like when we're going through school, Chad and I actually did pretty well in school, believe it or not. But we talked about how, when you go through school, you just get the concepts. So that's what really this is about. Keeping it simple, get the concept. So with the faster, more degradation. Okay. So what are some symptoms of that slow? That means high neurotransmitter levels, right? So you can have aggressive behavior, antisocial behavior, confusion, extreme agitation, and that's kind of not necessarily aggressive, but you can be agitated, right? Not necessarily the same thing. GI distress and muscle twitching. Now, each one of these, the GI distress, I would say, is definitely more with serotonin specifically, because remember, we talked about that GI contraction, right? With that serotonin. So if it's higher amount of, so you got a higher amount of transmitter, lower amount of enzyme. So that's what you'll get, that contraction, if you have more of that stimulation. The aggressiveness could actually be dopamine or serotonin. Antisocial behavior, that could be either one as well. I would say probably more dopamine if I'm thinking like clinically, but when you look at the test, it could go either way. Just some examples. Now here's some symptoms of some fast enzyme. You see, aggression is still on our list because aggression. Here's a funny thing about neurotransmitters. You can go either way with it. Like if you got too much, it's a bad thing. If you got too little, it's a bad thing. And you can have the same symptom. So if you have a symptom of aggression, it only tells you have a symptom of aggression. It doesn't really tell you like that's dopamine or that's serotonin. You can have multiple symptoms with the same, or multiple problems with the same symptom. Not everybody who has the same symptom has the same problem. So aggression, anxiety, social behavior, carbohydrate craving. And a lot of times the carb craving, it'll make you feel good for a little bit. You feel that way? Like, oh yeah, this is great. This is awesome. I love this carb. And then not so much later. Depression, worse during the winter months, impulsive tendencies, insomnia, low pain tolerance is something I just find very interesting about the whole thing, since I do see people with pain issues. The COMT is also one of those, both of these. And that's why we can actually put these together on a lot of things for neurotransmitters, is because they kind of reflect each other a little bit. So low pain tolerance, low self-esteem, OCD tendencies, panic disorders, post-traumatic stress. So if someone has post-traumatic stress, it doesn't mean they've got a problem with the neurotransmitter. So we're not saying that. They might, and if you could work on that, get the test. I mean, if you've got, honestly, anybody that's got some psychiatric stuff, it's never one thing that's going to fix the problem. There's always multiple things. So especially with panic disorders or post-traumatic stress, you really got to think about, therapy is an incredibly good idea. Trauma therapy, all that stuff. I refer out for it. It's very necessary in a lot of cases, but I've seen a lot of people with panic disorders who actually have blood sugar problems. And that's one of those base things. Blood sugar is so important. So a lot of times we want to say, I've got this gene, I've got this gene, I've got this gene. test the gene. If you test the gene, then, you know, it's not an excuse for your behavior. So we don't want to say that, but it's something that gives you something to work on. And poor dream recall and social phobia, that's kind of goes in with social anxiety as well. But the poor dream recall, I'm going to give you a little trick with that as well. If we are here in just a second, actually. So here's a sample report for this that you would see on your lab test. And the lab is super simple, by the way. I don't know if y'all know how to take a gene test. You could really it's a swab in your mouth. That's it. It's no invasive testing. And that's one of the reasons I like it too. You don't have to do any venipuncture. You don't even have to pee in a cup, which is pretty easy too. It's just a swab and send it out. So this is what the test looks like. Down here, it shows you the variant, and it shows you if, say, the MAOA, and it gives that little RS number. That's science geek talk for the actual gene, right? This one says you have slower form of the MAO enzyme. If you have slower enzyme, consider the nutritional protocols, yada, yada, yada. And over here, no variants for this one. But on the bottom of the sheet, it says, these are the things that we tend to see with these fast and slows. And this is wonderful. That's why I love this report. Like, it's wonderful. Like, this is one of the best things. I don't want to toot Chad's horn too much, but the test, the report is really what makes this. I mean, you can get other genetic testing. One, they're testing stuff that doesn't need to be tested. Two, or not necessarily, that doesn't need to be, but not necessary. But this stuff is clinically relevant. That's the important thing. But it breaks it down so you can understand it, and that's great. Now, so take a look at the fast MAO. We talked about that. It's breaking down too much. Here's some symptoms on the left side, and it gives you some support down here. I do have some quid pro quos, excuse me, about a couple of nutrients. It's like St. John's wort, if you're on medications, MAOI inhibitors, that's redundant, MAO inhibitors, or antidepressants or things like that, you have to be extremely cautious when you're taking some of this stuff. St. John's wort is one of them, and I'll give you another one later. So just be very cautious if you're just looking at this stuff. Like, that's me to a T. But if you're taking meds, just be very cautious. Bacopa is actually pretty okay as far as I know. I haven't had any problems with it, and I don't know of any research that says it is contraindicated. But St. John's wort is typically considered contraindicated if you're on meds. But tyrosine, Bacopa, copper balancing, that's a whole thing right there. Zinc and copper, I'm gonna tell you a story. And Chad, if you would let me know if I'm bad on time.
You're good, bro.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you a story about zinc and copper. So there's something called a cryptopyrrole disorder. And it's all based off of your ability to metabolize copper and zinc. There's a B6 issue in there too, which we're going to get to. But the story is, I have a lady who she's in her 80s. She already has a pacemaker, and after she had a COVID infection, she had a rhythm issue. She's already under the care of a cardiologist, and they were just like, here's some Eliquis. And I was like, okay, well, cool, take it. You know, let's figure out why you have this. I was like, what are you taking? And so one of the things she was taking was zinc. It's like, how long have you been taking the zinc? She said, since COVID started. So it's almost 2 years that she's taking zinc. Well, zinc will push out copper. Sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's bad. In her case, it got pushed out too much, and it caused an arrhythmia in the heart. And I said, okay, we got to add a little copper, but we got to balance that out with zinc and copper. Did that in a couple of weeks, no problem. So it was affecting, and for her, it was affecting the heart, but for others, it can affect the neurotransmitters and the whole system. So just be aware. For the high side, a lot of the high side stuff is really just supporting the metabolism. I'm on the high neurotransmitters. If it's high neurotransmitters, It's really about supporting the metabolic process. Really, that's more what it's really about. So let's run a little checklist if you can. Okay, here's the things that we want to be aware of. I'm easily stressed, panicked, or made anxious. Okay, that's not me, but I find it hard to calm down after becoming stressed or irritated. Sometimes that's me. I find it hard. Oh, sorry, that was repetitive. I enjoy cheese, wine, and or chocolate, but tend to feel irritable or off after I eat them. That is absolutely not me. But that's a big one. Chocolate, wine are two big factors in nutritional medicine. Well, the sugar is a big one too, but chocolate, as far as neurotransmitters go, we're going to talk more about that. I'm plagued with migraine headaches. Another one that could go back to wine. There's another enzyme that we're not talking about today. It does kind of play in with this MAO about histamines. So that's why it's like, well, you can have this, and then this gene can actually aggravate this one. So it gets, like I said, there's a cobweb. But plagued with migraine headaches and have difficult falling asleep. But when I do, I stay asleep. Okay. If you scored more than 50%, which I did that repetitively, so that was 2, 4, 5. So if you got 3 out of 5, you know what? You might want to just check the gene. Just check it. It's not a guarantee, but you know, some of that stress and irritation could be blood sugar related. I see it a lot, but that's why you got to get the gene tested. Here's the checklist for the fast. I fall asleep quickly, but wake up earlier than I'd prefer. That is definitely me. I'm prone to depression and a lack of desire. I find that chocolate gives me a great mood lift. Yeah, well, I can't say it gives me a mood lift. Now, my wife loves chocolate. I tend towards smoking or alcohol addiction or excessive use. I could say that's not smoking. Sometimes I like a little more alcohol than usual, than I probably should, but I keep it under check. So I'm going to say no to that one. I achieve better mood after eating carbohydrates, but that improved mood doesn't help my focus or attention. So that's what I was talking about before. That carb feels good, but I can tell that it's really messing with me. So again, that could also be a blood sugar issue too. So if you got 3 out of 5, consider at least testing. If you are just 5 out of 5, I mean, it's not a guarantee thing. Just check the gene. So at MAO inhibitors. So this is just a list of herbs that could be used. Again, the St. John's wort is down here. So that's one to honestly remember to be cautious with. So the agrimony, angelica, the barberry, bilberry, celery, coffee. I have a love-hate relationship with coffee because there are 2 things that mess with blood sugar. And I know this is a neurotransmitter talk, but everything, you have a foundation, and the blood sugar is really important. 2 things that can totally mess with your blood sugar: caffeine and alcohol. And so typically what I'll do is try to get people off of coffee for a while, kind of let them settle out. And then coffee can make them feel good, but it's always about keeping it balanced. Everything in moderation. Curcumin, echinacea, evening primrose, which I like a lot. And this actually gets into some of the evening primrose does have a hormonal benefit to it as well. And the uva ursi. So uva ursi is a really good antimicrobial, which while the uva ursi inhibits the enzyme, right? The barberry, the coriander, even the agrimony and the angelica as well, these can be antimicrobial. So if you've got a low-grade infection too, that's also something to really get checked, because those can aggravate those genes as well. Okay, so cofactors. What is a cofactor? Cofactor is a nutrient. It's a vitamin or mineral. And some of these we actually saw there: B2, B3, B6, magnesium, iron, and tyrosine. Tyrosine is that amino acid. the amino acid substrate. It is the building block for the amino acids. And it all starts with tyrosine or phenylalanine. But we typically use tyrosine. We don't, and iron is good in low doses, but iron can be inflammatory for a lot of people as well if you're already inflamed. I mean, get your levels checked. Magnesium, 40% of the population is deficient in magnesium, so it's a really good bet. In the brain, there's a lot of different magnesiums, and I like trying to pick the right one for somebody. In the brain, the magnesium 3 and 8 does tend to be a little bit better across the blood-brain barrier, but if somebody's got different issues, we might use a different magnesium. So I put the names of the vitamins here, the B2, B3, B6. Depending on what your vitamin metabolism rate is, again, those are other genes that we're not discussing today. You may want to go ahead and get these activated. That's what we say, they're activated, but these are phosphorylated, right? But they're activated. So the riboflavin, 5-phosphate. Niacin is niacinamide. It means it's already activated. Pyridoxine, 5-phosphate, or P5P. Here's a trick I'm going back to. Remember we talked about poor dream recall. The poor dream recall can actually be, there's a trick where you actually take kind of a high dose of the B6 every day and until you start to remember your dreams. And then you keep up that dose until you start getting weird dreams, and then you back off that dose. But like 50 milligrams is pretty high dose. I mean, if you're uncomfortable with it, you could go lower for a longer period of time. But I can say personally, it does, B6 is one of my favorite B vitamins if I had to pick one. But the B2 is actually a very calming. And they used to have I believe back in the day, like the origins of nutritional research, they had a vitamin G. And the vitamin G was a combination of B2 and B3. Am I correct on that, Chad?
I can't remember, man.
Can't remember that?
I think
it sounds familiar. Yeah. So it was a combination of B2 and B3, but it has a calming effect on the central nervous system. Anyway.
I'll go grab my Wally
book real quick. Do what?
I said I'll go grab my Wally book real quick and see.
Okay. Well, he would know. God rest his soul. Okay. The next is COMT. They call it COMT because it stands for Catechol-O-Methyltransferase, and that's too hard to say. So COMT, if you say COMT, everybody knows what you're talking about. If you're talking about MAO and you say MOA, nobody knows what you're talking about, so you mix up the letters, but everybody knows COMT. So this one actually removes neurotransmitters such as the dopamine and norepinephrine. Now, this is the one that's also indicated in that hormonal balance. We're not getting too much into the hormonal balance, but hormonal balance is really important in overall brain function, okay? So, fast and slow, we've already been through this. We know what it means. The fast version of COMT enzyme associated with decreased levels of the neurotransmitter. So it's fast, it eats it all up. Slow version, increased levels. We've already been through this. Okay, we're gonna do some confusing stuff. You have a VAL and a MET is what it's called. These are the types that you'll get. VAL, MET, or VAL-MET. The VAL is found often in nature. There is some reduction in the degradation or in the enzyme with that. The MET has a 3 to 4 times slower reduction at removing those catecholamines than the VAL. But the VAL is most often in nature. But depending on who you're talking to and what you're reading, the VAL-MET is considered ideal. However, another quid pro quo, the VAL-MET does have negative associations in mental health, as it has been related to schizophrenia, as well as bipolar disorders, eating disorders, OCD, panic disorders, and anxiety. So if you have the VAL-MET and you don't have a schizophrenic disorder and you don't have these disorders, it's not something we're incredibly concerned about. However, if you've already got the condition, and those conditions usually pop up earlier in life than they do later in life. Then if you've got it and you're, in your 20s, then in 30s, then you're probably, hopefully not going to get a schizophrenic diagnosis. It does happen, but not too worried about it. Funny enough, there's some older research that traces the origins of schizophrenia back to the flu virus. Interesting. Okay, what are the fast symptoms? Depression, lack of motivation, fatigue, focus issues, constipation, GERD, that's a gastroesophageal reflux disease, and muscle cramps. So that means you're not getting enough stimulation. I mean, the fatigue alone, that's just not getting enough firing. Carb lover and chocoholic. Here's where the chocoholic comes in. Chocolate is a great dopamine mimic. And if you've got this gene and you're a chocoholic, or if you're a chocoholic and you don't know you have the gene, you need to get the gene tested, because you may have a reduction in that dopamine, because your body's constantly trying to get that stimulus, right? So it's not that you're an addict, but it's like your body just needs the stimulation. It wants to work well. And that's a lot of times we find out your body wants to work. It just got confused somehow, like something happened to it. The same thing with carbs. We've talked about that before. Slow, ADD, ADHD, anxiety, mania, insomnia, addiction, excessive energy. So again, slow enzyme, multiple or more transmitter than necessary, and we've got that excitatory, okay? And headaches with chocolate or alcohol. So if it's slow, you've got more transmitter, right? So say you've got that dopamine there and you try to push it with the chocolate, gives you a headache. Here's another report. These are sample reports. John Doe, he won't mind if I'm showing this. This isn't about HIPAA violation. So over here, the COMT V158M. This is the variant. You have the ideal, right? This is the ideal. The COMT H62H. This is one of it's another variant. I'm just talking about the Valmet, but it's another variant, and you got to look at different variants as well, so you can get a bigger picture. So just one variant isn't necessarily enough, and that's why MaxGen has actually put in the most clinically relevant SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that are in this report. And this is the works, by the way, which is perfect. Again, here we go. Same thing that we talked about before. Things that we can do: depression, lack of motivation, fatigue, focus issues, depression, restless leg. I'll give you a trick for restless leg. I've had really good luck with restless leg. But what it does, it's not like high dose. It's actually low dose, like electrolyte form. But it does in that electrolyte form, it actually calms the nervous system. And you got to be careful. Speaking about calming the nervous system, people who have pain or anxiety, and women especially, and they're taking a calcium supplement, they should actually take a break from it and see how the pain goes, because the calcium can stimulate that sympathetic nervous system. So, and I've seen it on multiple occasions where someone was hurting and they're like, what are you taking? Calcium. Give it a break. Oh, I feel better. Okay. But it doesn't mean you don't need it. You got to get the right forms, yada, yada. So that's the fast, slow. We talked about this too. And I think we've got more on that too. One of the things about the high norepinephrine, look down there, anxiety, heart palpitations, sweating, those are also signs of blood sugar issues. But it's that adrenaline that gets pumped, you're just high epinephrine, high norepinephrine. Those are super stimulating. And that's where, the caffeine and the alcohol can really do some damage. we definitely want to do some adaptogens for that. And when it says on there, they don't get into specifics, but ashwagandha is really popular. Rhodiola, super popular, and very effective as well. Licorice root can be very helpful. There's lots of different adaptogens that you can do, but phosphatidylserine is great. One of the things that phosphatidylserine does, so if you're getting a stimulation of your brain is stimulating your adrenal medulla, and that's where the epinephrine comes from, right? If your brain is stimulating the center part of your adrenal gland that sits on top of your kidney and is pumping out adrenaline, the phosphatidylserine actually kind of just blunts that effect and helps calm down that cycle. So a checklist for the slow COMT: headaches. It means you got a lot of neurotransmitter there, a lot of stimulation. You get headaches, find falling asleep a challenge, overstimulated, easily become anxious or irritable, stimulation. Separate from the PMS, that's where we get into this is where we get into the hormonal aspect of this. And I'm coming to what we can do with this, but it comes at the end. And sensitive to pain. So you have low pain threshold. That's really hard to gauge. Pain is really hard to gauge. And when you go to the hospital, you've got a face and the 10 faces, and like you got this one is the first one, and then that's the 10th one. So like, which one are you? But it's still hard to gauge. I mean, I remember a doc when we were in school said she had somebody come into her office, walked into the office, and he was an ex-Army Ranger, and he did some orthopedic tests on him. It's like, it just felt weird in there. She's like, I'm gonna take an x-ray. She looked at the hip, one of his hips was completely dislocated, and he came in walking in on it. Did you ever hear that story, Chad?
I didn't, but I mean, that's the warrior gene. So
Yeah.
Warrior, obviously.
Yeah, he was an ex-Army Ranger. Yep. They're like, dude, that was one bad dude. So he, so completely dislocated, but he was just like, hurts a little bit. Obviously, warrior, and his COMT was probably just perfect. Anyway, the fast, struggle with attention and focus. I'm easily addicted to substances or activities, shopping, gaming, smoking, alcohol, social media. I think social media has other problems or other things associated with it as well. But anytime we're like spending hours at something, when our attention is focused on something, nowadays that what we know about addiction, we have to really consider, like, am I addicted to something as trivial as social media or gaming or shopping? Like, we really do have to consider this. And again, since you have the gene, it's not an excuse for the behavior. That's where the therapy comes in, talking to somebody about, your life and your choices, Prone to feelings of depression, lack of motivation, a little stimulus. I feel an initial happy rush after eating lots of carbs and starchy foods, but feeling of depression return quickly. Do you see that the MAO and the COMT, they kind of see, that's why they're together right here, is because they kind of look alike, and you need to get both those pictures. Cofactors, again, the riboflavin, the folate, and the cobalamin. Cobalamin or cobalamin, whatever you want to say. Magnesium, and there's something called SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine is the name of it. I'll come back to it. B2 riboflavin, again, really calming. The folate and the cobalamin. We really got to watch these. These are your methylated forms of nutrients. So the B9, the B12, and the SAMe, we must be careful. If you have the slower COMT, you may be sensitive to the methyl donors. And in this case, you might need to do the non-methylated vitamins like folinic acid, which is still a great folic acid type of supplementation, or hydroxycobalamin versus methylcobalamin. But if you get your Max Gen tests, you could see that you may actually need some adenosylcobalamin. So For instance, I have 2 daughters. They're wonderful. One of them is 1 and one of them is 3. On the 3-year-old, she needs the methyls. On the 1-year-old, she needs the adenosine. I don't know where it comes from. It's not me. It's not my wife. I think she got it from her grandmother. I'm not sure. Actually, it still could be my wife, and I misread the information. So, but it doesn't matter. I look at her, I'm like, okay, cool. They both need B12, but hers is adenosine. So again, the fast support, we've been through this, the tyrosine, the bacopa, riboflavin. Vitamin C is incredibly helpful for lots of things. I mean, you can use vitamin C high dose for all kinds of stuff. And then, but just making sure that, you know, the RDA is like 60 milligrams, something like that. I think it's a joke as far as like supplementation and actually using it therapeutically. The higher doses are going to be a little bit better. The methylation, that's where we're talking about those B vitamins. And I added in here royal jelly. This is something from bees. So the bees make honey, shocker. They make propolis, which is an incredible antimicrobial, but they also make royal jelly because that's going to be the food for the queen. And she gets the primo stuff. But it's a great adaptogen, again, for stress and all that stuff. And I think in Chinese medicine, they started using it eons ago because they figured out, well, if it's for the queen, we'll give it to our royalty too. And they use it for longevity purposes. Okay. So there's lots of supplements, but you can't take a lot of supplements. Best thing you should do is eat a nice, healthy diet. So in the dietary support, we want dark leafy greens, nuts, seeds, fish, beans, avocados, and whole grains. Excuse me. Your dark leafy greens, that's where you're going to get your like natural folates from, you know, good fats and B vitamins. The whole grains, we got a lot of times we get problems with the whole grains with food sensitivities. This is a general list and not intended to say, well, if you've got a B vitamin problem, but you've got a gluten sensitivity, you should eat wheat. That's not what we're saying. This is like a general recommendation. Food sensitivities is another thing. Now, the beets, carrots, onions, and artichokes, and the cruciferous vegetables. Cruciferous are your broccolis, cauliflowers, kales, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. Only in the past few years have I really been able to stand cabbage. But once you start doing it, here's another thing. Eat stuff that tastes bad, that you know is healthy. Figure out a way to make it taste good. Look up recipes and just try not to add a lot of sugar and crap to it and start eating healthier foods, but just get used to it because it's what your body wants. And I tell patients, we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and this thing has a mind of its own. And a lot of times we're screwing it up. So it wants good food. Bitter vegetables such as dandelion greens and radishes. Okay, this last 3 here, these are really good for that liver. And when you're talking about hormonal metabolism, the liver is the king. This is where you got to get the liver flowing. And sorry, yeah, you've got to get the liver flowing. So if you have problems with the COMT and there's an estrogen clearing problem with the COMT, this makes this more important. You have to get this, you have to get all these things in there, get the liver flowing, push that out. So I'm going to tell a story. I know a doctor who was in charge, or not in charge, but she was on a global committee, which was only like a handful of doctors, but they were from around the world. And they were all working on this project about this lake in, I think it was Louisiana. And they figured out that the alligators in the lake, the population was dwindling. And they couldn't figure out why. They said, well, when they started, there was one guy who got in there, and it was one of the scientists. He got in there and he was really in charge of the whole thing. And they were kind of like background, like, what are we going to do? So this guy gets in there and he figures out that the males are not mating with the females, and the genitals of the males are shrinking from their average over the generations. And he said, I don't understand this. We're going to test the water. And when he tested the water, it was completely polluted. And the chemicals that they were pulling out of there were estrogen mimics. xenoestrogens, and xenoestrogens is a term that just means it's basically a estrogen pollutant, and these can come from multiple sources. They could be in your makeup, they could be in your shampoos, they can be in your water supply, they can be in it's numerous. The pesticides, toxins, they found all kinds of stuff in here. So they ended up taking the water, they actually cleaned up the lake. And after a couple of generations, after they cleaned up the lake, the males were actually going back to normal, and they were starting to mate with the females, and the population started going up again. So the guy that was in there wrestling the alligators and getting them out of there, guess what happened to him? Yeah, he got lymphoma and he died. You thought I was going to say something else, but he got lymphoma and he died because of all the toxins. So I'm telling you, detoxification is one of the best things you can do for yourself. You know, your liver has 4 lobes, but when you break down the liver, it has 8 sections. And it is said that it takes 4 to 8 weeks to detox one section. So if you want to detox all 8 sections, it could take you almost a year. But if you've got these genes here, you could actually be doing better, or you could be doing worse, and say, hey, look, these tests are going to help you decide and give you evidence, show you, like, look, right here, self, I've got this problem and I need to do something about it, or at least stay on top of it, so I can be the best person I can be. So detoxification is great. This is the type of style diet we really want. It's whole foods. It's whole foods. So more diets, stop the stimulants, unless you've got that MAO and you slow gene and you need to inhibit it. Then you can do, a cup of coffee a day. And actually, depending on some people drink coffee all day long. They could have the MAO. Anyway, keep your blood sugar balanced. Again, it's a basic function. Avoid toxins best you can. So that committee, they actually found out that most of the toxins are in the home. So good water filtration, your air, lots of filters. I use a purifier. We filter, but we also purify. They're not the same. Under purification, the filters get below or right about 3 microns, but all the other toxins and viruses and stuff, they do better with the purification with ozone particles and stuff like that. And then your food, that was the other thing to control in your home. Organic is always best, just telling you. And then regular detoxification. That's what we want to do. And I think that is it for me.
Well, good.
I hope I didn't take too much time.
No, I think you're right at about 50 minutes, 45 minutes, 50 minutes.
Oh, wow. I didn't mean to do that. I thought I was going to do 30.
Dude, you're good. You're good. Not a single person left. So you didn't blow them too bad. Thanks, Don. I appreciate it. We'll have Don back soon. I think we already have something scheduled, I believe, and we've discussed it. So
yeah.
Thanks, everybody. And stay tuned for the next one.
Thanks, Chad.
No, thank you, Don. See you, bud.